Hello, I'm April Brown with Zelken Financial Services, LLC, and I'm back with the tip, today's illuminated point. So, I wanted to talk about a book that I read a while back, and it's called The Whiteness of Wealth, How the Tax System Impoverishes Black Americans and How We Can Fix It, by the author Dorothy A. Brown. First of all, what you don't know is I love to read. Reading for me allows me to get different perspectives and points of views. And, just kind of learn about different topics that I may not necessarily be familiar with, but it just gives me an open and an avenue to, finding out something different. Being in the financial industry is really important for me to understand what I'm doing and how I'm doing it and how this applies to my clients. And so one of the things I always talk about is the tax perspective. And if you've watched any of my videos from the tax perspective, I always talk about the MERIT. So MERIT is an acronym that stands for mortgage, estate planning, retirement, insurance, and taxes. And so to me, the overall arching thing is really taxes, right? So taxes is the umbrella by which all of those other things kind of fall under. And on top of that, they are also impacted by taxes in some very way, shape, or form. So about the author, Brown was previously the Assay Griggs Grandler Professor of Law at Emory University, and now is the Martin D. Ginsburg Chair in Taxation at Georgetown University Law Center. So she is a tax lawyer, if you didn't get all of that. All right, moving on. So reading the book, I really wanted to understand what her perspective was around the U.S. tax system and really like African Americans or Black folks or Black Americans. And I found the book to be informative, and I learned several things about the tax system that I had no idea about. There was a lot of information in it, and she was specific in talking about Black Americans and their lack of the ability to gain wealth, and how the tax system itself impacts the ability for Black Americans to acquire and gain wealth. So she breaks down the tax system into 6 chapters. And the chapters are as follows. Chapter 1, Married While Black. Chapter 2, Black House, White Market. Chapter 3, The Great Unequalizer. Chapter 4, The Best Jobs. Chapter 5, Legacy. And Chapter 6, What Next? So I'm going to kind of hit on some of the points. Some of the chapters will have a little more than others, but I will say this, you got to read the damn book. Just read. It's a lot, and the information is really good information. Chapter 1, Married While Black. So this chapter talks about marriage status when filing taxes and the disadvantages of filing jointly as a married couple for Black Americans. And she goes pretty in depth in terms of how this came to be and why you need to know marriage status was important in terms of filing taxes and so on. And so she talks about this whole thing. And there's a couple who kicks this whole thing off, but that was like back then. Anyway, so what struck me in reference to this chapter was the belief in conventional wisdom around marriage. And so that marriage can lead to economic stability, and marriage is a way to get out of poverty. It might be conventional wisdom, however, it doesn't necessarily work for Black couples, is what she's saying in the book or in this particular chapter. So she goes in depth about why and actually gives some suggestions about how to make marriage status filing more equitable. And essentially what she calls is marriage neutrality. And she gives a definition into it and so on and so forth. But anyway, okay, so what's really interesting about this chapter, and it's so funny because, when I think about this, I was talking to a friend of mine as I was reading the book, and I mentioned to her about the filing jointly and how, it's not really great for Black couples. And she was like, girl, ain't that the truth? So she's been married for about 5 years now, and she talked about the difference between filing single, which is still expensive, but anyway, and filing jointly now that she's married. And that she said, I'd never paid taxes, and now I'm paying more taxes than I ever expected. So it's just kind of like, it gives credence to what she was talking about. That's why I mentioned it. So chapter 2, Black House, White Market. So in this chapter, she's talking about home ownership and the discriminatory history around home ownership for Black Americans in this country. And so some of the things she hits on is redlining, mortgage discrimination, which is still damn happening, and the Fair Housing Act and how that impacted, where people lived at and what you could and could not do and what was, basically a discriminatory act. So the takeaways from this for me is the truth in terms of home ownership in America. She says is rigged and has been from the beginning. And so when you look at, some of the things that she's talking about, I can understand why she says what she says. And but what she does say is, if you're a Black homeowner, one needs to make sure they protect themselves in this white dominated market. And she talks about how that should be done. And so she goes really in depth in around that. And she talks about the survey that was done in reference to where people wanted to live. It was really interesting. But that's chapter 2. So on to chapter 3, which is the great unequalizer. Now I was trying to figure out what the hell this chapter was. Well, guess what it was about? It was about education and the cost of attaining a college education and the negative impact it has for Black Americans. And some of it she, hits on HBCUs versus PWIs and how the implications for that can vary and what that means for Black America versus going to an HBCU as opposed to going to a PWI. And this particular chapter has a lot of information, and it goes into how taxes impact paying for your education. Who knew? Who knew taxes are going to have that kind of impact in terms of education and what you're trying to do. Anyway. So chapter 4, which of course makes sense because it talks about the best jobs. Well, now that your ass has gotten a college education that you done paid out the nose for, and you trying to, you're saddled with damn debt, you got to get a job. And so she hits on this, which is labor market, basically the wage gap and unemployment rates for really newly graduated folks. And it was a lot in this chapter. I actually had to read this thing twice just to make sure I was like getting all the ins and outs. And I didn't get it all, but I got enough to be able to understand, damn, if I was going to college right now, I don't know. I'd do it, but I'd have to be smart about how I did it. So for me, it never occurred to me that taxes would impact your education in terms of your college education and what that meant and what it means in terms of that wealth building piece. So that's chapter 4. Chapter 5, legacy. So, okay. First of all, before I even say anything about legacy, I want to say this. The wealth gap. When I got into this industry, I thought that there was a way to lessen that wealth gap between African Americans or Black Americans and white America. And after reading her book, I realized it's going to take way, way more than what I thought. However, great chapter. So I'll say this. There was a lot to unpack in that chapter. But the one sentence that stuck with me and struck me was this: whiteness itself and the legacy of it, advantages that come with it, is the magnet that attracts wealth. So I'm going to say it one more time. Whiteness itself and the legacy of advantages that come with it is the magnet that attracts wealth. What else is there to say? So, on to chapter 6. Last chapter, and it's titled What Next? So in this chapter, she talks about what needs to happen in order for the wealth gap to shrink. She talks about the ways taxes and some other pivotal moves that could be made that could make the difference in terms of shrinking the wealth gap for Black Americans. But they, some of that requires a little bit of everything. But anyway, and so, the kind of like the rounding piece of it is making the tax system more equitable for everyone. And that is really going to be part of the key of helping shrink that wealth gap also. Otherwise, I highly recommend reading the book. I enjoyed it. And I actually told several people I know about the book and was like, check it out. Really. And of course, I'm going to read it again because I'm sure there will be things that I missed the first time that I'll get the second time around or the third time around, because I do like to reread books, because I think it's important for me to really understand and get the gist of what I'm doing in my particular, line of work. So I hope you enjoyed this. And please subscribe and like my YouTube channel. I am April Brown with Zelken Financial Services, LLC. And until the next time, have a great day.